Hello, I'm Dilek Tuna. Welcome to Africa News. Here are the top stories. The United Nations urges armed groups in Congo to protect civilians and allow aid access. Four children were stabbed dead at Kampala kindergarten. And South African farmers grapple with rising diesel costs as harvest season approaches. The United Nations has warned that the humanitarian situation in the Democratic Republic of Congo continues to deteriorate due to ongoing violence in the country's eastern provinces and called for extra funding.
The UN Refugee Agency and 123 of our partners are urgently seeking $1.6 billion to provide food, shelter, healthcare protection, and dignified support for 5.9 million people across 7 countries neighboring Sudan by year's end. The plan also promotes longer-term solutions, such as helping governments, including refugees in national systems, and expand access to services. Host governments and local communities continue to demonstrate remarkable solidarity. However, their capacity is being pushed to the brink, underscoring the need for a consecutive 4th annual appeal on this scale. We continue to call for stronger international backing to address the persistent underfunding of humanitarian operations in the countries hosting people fleeing Sudan, and we await a lasting peace. And we reiterate once again, especially in light of the continuing attacks on civilians.
A man posing as a parent stabbed and killed 4 children at a kindergarten in Uganda's capital, Kampala, police said on Thursday. Police spokesperson Rachel Kawala said the attacker had visited the school days earlier, seeking admission for their child before returning and carrying out the attack with a knife. The suspect was arrested at the scene and remains in police custody. The incident has triggered renewed calls for tighter security at educational institutions, particularly those catering to young children.
This is daycare.
Nigeria's President Bola Tinubu travelled to the northern city of Jos on Thursday to meet with families devastated by a Palm Sunday massacre that killed at least 30 people last week. Gunmen attacked a university community in the Central Plateau state on Sunday night. It follows a long-running conflict between farmers, who are mostly Christians, and herders, who are mostly Muslim, in Nigeria's Middle Belt. Tinubu consoled bereaved families and said the government would do what it can to provide them with support.
For the victims, let's see what we can do. For their losses, we cannot replace in human beings. But whatever we do to give them minimum comfort, we will. We are going to install immediately a network of cameras that will help the law enforcement agencies to identify the troublemakers instantly.
A steep rise in fuel prices in Nigeria is pushing up the cost of daily life as businesses and households adjust to tighter transport and energy expenses. Here's more.
Fuel prices in Nigeria have surged sharply, driving up the cost of living and putting pressure on businesses and households across the country. In Lagos, barber Wale Johnson begins his day by switching on a fuel-powered generator, essential in areas where electricity supply is unreliable. As petrol prices rose by more than 60% in March, his operating costs increased. He has raised the price of a haircut by about half to keep up.
Everybody has to pay one fine because of the situation in Nigeria now, and they all understand. Even though some of them are not ready to comply, but they don't have any choice. By the time we explain to them, they need to comply.
In many neighbourhoods, power shortages leave streets dimly lit, forcing homes and businesses to depend on generators. Johnson says the situation is hard to accept in an oil-producing nation. The surge follows a global oil shock linked to tensions involving Iran, with Nigeria recording one of the steepest fuel price increases among major African economies. Even with the Dangote refinery operating at full capacity, limited access to domestic crude means it still relies partly on imports. That dependence adds to costs in a deregulated market where domestic fuel prices closely follow international benchmarks. For many Nigerians, the impact is immediate. Transport fares have risen sharply, while incomes have remained largely unchanged. Experts say local refining cannot fully shield the country from global price pressures.
So they need to also import crude, and that then means it adds to the cost. Those costs we're avoiding by locally refining. You still have to pay them if you have to bring in the crude you are going to refine. I think that's one critical point. But you can then argue that many of the other countries too have to bring international crude. Like South Africa is not a producer, so they have to bring in international crude. So where is it higher?
Food costs are also rising as businesses pass on increased fuel and transport expenses. The strain is fueling frustration, with drivers and workers staging protests and calling for government support. As fuel prices continue to climb, many say meeting basic daily needs is becoming increasingly difficult.
South Africa is cutting fuel taxes to ease rising costs linked to global oil price shocks, as neighbouring Lesotho faces fears of sharp increases.
South Africa is cutting fuel taxes to ease rising costs linked to global oil price shocks, as neighbouring Lesotho faces fears of sharp increases. South Africa says it will reduce its fuel levy for April, aiming to limit the impact of rising global oil prices linked to the Iran war. The move follows pressure from businesses and trade unions, but even with the cut, fuel prices are still expected to rise.
It doesn't give me much reassurance, how long is this relief going to be before they up it again, So it gives some sort of, okay, cool, there's some certainty that, okay, it's not going to be as bad, but when are they going to up it again by another 2-3 more rand?
South Africa depends heavily on imported fuel, making it vulnerable to global price shocks and geopolitical tensions. Officials say further support measures could be introduced if the conflict continues.
Should the situation or the conflict escalate, the government will still have some form of intervention in place. So this is not the first time that government introduced some form of intervention. Right in 2022, at the beginning of the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, there was an intervention in a form of reduced the government levies, and this is now repeated again. Obviously, this is something that the public will expect that it will happen should we find ourselves in this situation into the future.
Across the border in Lesotho, concerns are growing, with residents rushing to buy fuel amid fears prices could sharply increase. The situation highlights how global conflicts are driving fuel costs higher, putting pressure on economies across the region.
South Africa's farmers are racing to complete their harvest as rising diesel prices and fuel shortages threaten to disrupt operations, putting both crops and incomes at risk.
South Africa's agricultural sector is facing a looming harvest season crisis as tensions between the United States, Israel and Iran disrupt global energy supply chains. Shipping constraints through the Strait of Hormuz have driven diesel prices sharply higher, placing farmers under severe financial and logistical strain just days before the critical maize and soya harvest. In key farming regions such as Lichtenburg, producers are racing against time as fuel shortages threaten to halt harvesting operations. With diesel prices climbing to around 24 rand per litre, many farmers are grappling with rising costs and unreliable supply.
7, 8, 38, 16 by 38. Straight after harvest, we would start preparing for the new season. And if fuel prices remain at these elevated levels, with already depleted profit margins, it doesn't make any financial sense at all to grow maize.
Fuel reserves on some farms are now only sufficient for a few days of harvesting, with heavy machinery consuming thousands of litres daily. Orders placed weeks ago at lower prices have yet to be fulfilled, as suppliers struggle with the same shortages and distribution bottlenecks affecting the wider market. Harvesting for crops such as soybeans must be completed within a narrow window to preserve quality. Any delay risks downgrading produce and cutting already thin profit margins. The AgriSay warns that fuel accounts for roughly 20% of a farmer's operating costs.
Remember, if you have a shortage of diesel or your fuel prices is going up, that's 20% of the average farmer in South Africa's cost in farming. So for us, it's about the supply chain, the effect thereof back into our supply chain. And we know that you can only add it to a price of a produce. And so it means the inflation of food is going to go up. And that's the last thing we want as farmers.
With further fuel price increases taking effect, concerns are also mounting about the longer-term impact. Farmers warn that if elevated energy costs persist, planting staple crops such as maize in the next season may no longer be economically viable. For now, the priority remains clear: complete the harvest before fuel supplies run out, in what is becoming an increasingly uncertain season for South Africa's agricultural heartland.
Kenya's key sector is coming under strain as shipping disruptions linked to the Iran conflict have millions of kilograms stuck at port, raising losses and putting pressure on farmers' incomes.
Kenya's tea exports are under pressure as shipping disruptions linked to the Iran conflict leave large volumes stranded at port. Around 8 million kilograms of tea have been stuck in warehouses in Mombasa for weeks, with losses estimated at about $8 million per week.
The Middle East takes an average of 20-25%, buys an average of 20-25% from this auction. And Pakistan, which also neighbors Iran, buys 40%. So we are talking about a market share of 65%. So should this war continue, then the impact, the negative consequences will be more severe to the tea trade and tea value chain players.
Tea shipments to key markets such as Pakistan and Egypt are still moving, but only via the longer route around the Cape of Good Hope, driving up freight and insurance costs and squeezing exporters' margins.
This tea subsector actually supports around millions of people in Kenya, actually small-scale farmers. And so if this war continues, we see so many people going hungry, children dropping out of school, and people skipping meals.
At village buying centres, farmers say reduced earnings are already affecting daily life. Many warn that delayed sales and lower returns are making it harder to cover basic needs.
I'm very worried, very worried. Some of us, we have got problem because we also rely them with the health. Because when we plug this tea, we take it to the market, we go to the hospital, we pay this with this cash we take from our tea.
Kenya exports an average of 100 million kilograms of tea annually to Middle East markets, leaving the sector highly exposed to prolonged disruption. The disruption comes as major carriers suspend routes through the Strait of Hormuz and Bab el-Mandeb, forcing vessels to reroute around the Cape of Good Hope.
Russian President Vladimir Putin says Russia will supply Egypt with grain as Moscow moves to strengthen food exports. He said the country expects stable supplies after a strong harvest last year. Putin also proposed creating a grain and energy hub in Egypt as Russia looks for new export routes under Western sanctions. Egypt is the world's largest wheat importer and a key buyer of Russian grain.
Following my telephone conversation with the President of Egypt, I instructed the government to work with our Egyptian colleagues on issues related to food supplies to Egypt, primarily our grain. Egypt is our partner, and in this regard I would like to say that last year we achieved good results in agriculture. With a good harvest, we have no supply issues and do not expect to have any in the future.
And that's all we have today on Africa News. Thank you for watching and stay tuned to A News.